Thank you. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. This is an open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. I'm Joshua Levy, Committee Chair. It's Wednesday, January 5th, 2022, and the meeting is being conducted remotely, consistent with current state regulations, and is being recorded. Public access to the meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless the law requires it. This meeting will not have public comment except in connection with the first item of business, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. First, I will confirm that a quorum of the members of the Finance Committee are present. When I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. Barry Kaufman.
Here.
Tom Jacob.
Here.
Rick Lunetta.
Here.
Dick Riley.
Here.
Louise Miller.
Here.
Jim Healy. Jim Healy, we're taking attendance.
Hi, Josh. I'm here.
Thank you. Carol Fischetti. I saw her earlier. Dick Riley. You're on mute, Dick.
I said here twice. You got me once
sorry.
already.
Sorry.
Louder.
Carol Fischetti.
Yes. Here.
And our Executive Secretary, Louise Misgard.
Here.
I hope I didn't miss anyone, did I? Okay, and the chair is here. As a reminder, anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. As a preliminary matter, I would ask for a motion to continue the meeting to January 12th, 2022 in the event of a technical disruption this evening.
So moved. Second.
We'll take a roll call. Dick,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Louise,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Carol,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes. Passes. So the first item on the agenda is citizen request to address the Finance Committee. If there's a Needham resident who wishes to address the Finance Committee, please use the raise hand feature through Zoom to indicate that you'd like to speak. If you're on the telephone, you can also press *9. I'm looking right now at the attendee list. I don't see anyone raising their hand at the moment. So we'll give everyone a minute, I suppose. In the meantime, we can move to approval of the minutes of the prior meeting, December 15th, 2021. Did everyone have a chance to look those over?
Yes. I move their approval.
Second.
And I think that's subject to some minor corrections. Is that correct, Louise? Okay.
Yes, and I've nothing since I've last distributed it.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay, we'll take a roll call. Dick,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Louise,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Carol,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes as well. That passes. So I still don't see anyone with their hand raised in the attendees. So I think we'll move on to the next item, the department budget hearings. The first is fleet capital. I think I'll hand it over to Louise Miller to introduce that budget.
Sure. And I think it's actually, we're going to have a pretty quick discussion. As part of one of the documents that was sent by Louise Misgard, we had the capital that was being recommended at this point by the town manager. That included the fleet that is being recommended for fiscal year 2023. Last year, when we looked at the fleet being recommended for fiscal year 2023, we were looking at approximately $1.7 million. This year, we're looking at $1.4 million. There were a number of fleet vehicles that were removed from the list for replacement for fiscal year 2023. And speaking with Dave Davison, and he has a complete list, the reason for removal of the fleet vehicles was one, that they could, last another year or maybe 2 years. So they were not quite ready to be replaced. And also we're seeing inflation with respect to the purchase price on some of the vehicles, so that what we had for estimates on some of the vehicles is no longer a valid estimate for fiscal year 2023. Now, I would caution that we don't know where inflation is going. And so we may need to make further adjustments to the replacement list. There were a couple of vehicles that needed to be brought forward that were slated for replacement in fiscal year 2024 or later that needed to be brought to fiscal year 2023. There were actually only 2 of those vehicles. In addition to that, there's a request for an additional vehicle by the Parks Department. And I was going to let DPW speak to the need for that additional vehicle. Dave and I did discuss the status of Needham as a green community and what that means in terms of replacement cycle and what types of vehicles need to replace the ones that we are disposing of. And so Dave, as usual, is right on top of it. And so he has information regarding the fuel efficiency of vehicles and the federal requirements with respect to emissions, so that we are going to continue to meet the goals of the town with respect to emissions and meet our green communities goals. We also discussed what happens with respect to either trade-in or auctioning of vehicles. And that is an active process where vehicles, as they are replaced, are evaluated for trade-in or auction. Those vehicles where we believe we can get a better price by auction are auctioned off. And we do have information from the DPW on that value. So part of our capital plan is to credit or to transfer, I shouldn't say credit, to transfer amounts that we have received from the auction into the capital improvement fund. And if you recall, our goal for the capital improvement fund is approximately $1 million. For the last 2 years, because of COVID, we have not transferred money in, and that really has to do with keeping town meeting as streamlined as possible. I would say that we need to return to that. We need to get to our goal. We are auctioning a sufficient number of vehicles every year that we should be able to reach our $1 million goal and not just let that money go to free cash. Once we reach that goal, we should think about where we want those funds to go on an ongoing basis. And they can be as much as $200,000 or $100,000. So I think that's a pretty fair overall summary of fleet maintenance. I think we're going to get more information and more detail when we get the capital plan. But I would ask, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, that the DPW explain their request for an additional vehicle for fiscal year 23, because we are actually at that point adding to the existing fleet.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, I'd be happy to hear from Cecilia and John.
Cecilia, you want me lead or?
Yeah, go ahead and start.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. As part of our annual fleet review, when we're looking at vehicles that are scheduled for replacement and doing our evaluations to determine if they can be pushed out or if condition may warrant an early replacement, this year we actually went a little bit deeper because of the data that we've been gathering and finding that each division in the vehicles that they have and the personnel and the needs of operations each day, when we went through each division, we put a person in each vehicle for the purposes of daily operations. So these are all work vehicles that we were really primary focusing on to make sure that we had enough to do our mission, daily and snow and ice special ops, things of that nature. And what we found is that the parks and forestry, but mostly the parks division, was very short-handed on their vehicles. They were they were running leaner than any other division when you put a personnel count to the number of vehicles they had. It got very challenging for them, and we were backfilling that as much as possible with our pool, but in some cases those pool backfilling was almost permanent. So we started looking at what our options are, and all of this gets further complicated by summer help. When the summer help comes in, Parks is by far the largest beneficiary of that additional needed labor, and we just find it very, very difficult to move people around to get the jobs done at that time. So when we went through this process, that's why we evaluated, and we found that an additional 1 ton or medium duty dump truck would serve them best from that perspective.
Okay. I guess maybe we could pause there and see if there are any questions about that particular vehicle. Are there any questions from the committee about that?
Just one, Mr. Chair. Not questioning the need for it, but if you need to transport people, is that vehicle sufficient to transport the numbers that you need?
It's a start. I mean, of course, they could probably use 2, or however, this would be, I think it would be best to consider the 1 and then see how it works out. And if we can backfill with the pool sufficiently at that point, then that's great. However, the condition of some of our pool vehicles, we end up losing them prematurely. They don't make it through a full season, usually for mechanical expense reasons or emissions and safety reasons. And that's part of the challenge that when we're backfilling with the pool.
John, excuse me, John, Mr. Chair, that really wasn't my question. You're buying a dump truck to transport people. And if staff is an issue to get them from point B to point B to get the projects done, my question is the dump truck the appropriate vehicle?
It is, because it's not a point A to point B function. It's a point A to perform a task. And frequently they're loading it with material, tools, and coming back and forth for that process. So they need to make multiple dumps, and its most efficient process is to utilize a dump.
Thank you.
Any other questions about that vehicle? Okay. I had a more general question, I guess, about fleet. I think a couple of years ago, there was an implementation of a new program to monitor electronically usage of vehicles, wear and tear on the vehicles remotely with, I think, devices that would capture the data on the vehicles, and they would be collected on a regular interval so that they could be monitored. What's the progress of that program, and how has that helped your operations?
Well, we've had 3 additions to the fleet program since I've gotten here that have assisted us in gathering data. One of them is the fuel depot itself, and the fueling of the vehicles and the logging of mileage at those times, so we can quantify the efficiency, the mileage of each unit at that point. Also, we have a fleet management system now that's active and tied into other components. The repair processes are all logged in there as well. And anytime a member of the DPW has an issue with the vehicle, they log a request through that. So we're capturing all that data of all the issues that occur, all the PMs, the preventive maintenances that take place, the evaluations, the lubrications, all of those are now logged. But I think you may be referring to as the GPS systems. The GPS systems were installed in about 75 vehicles, if I'm not mistaken. And those are tracked for, how a driver performs, his braking, acceleration practices, the utilization of the vehicle, and the mileage that it can attain, as well as location services. You can see them actively. One of the better things that it's really been highlighted as is in the snow and ice program. We can actively see the vehicles traveling around town and see breadcrumb trails where they've treated and where they've been throughout a snow and ice event.
Go ahead, Louise, do you have a question?
So, yeah, what I was going to say is, so, but now you have a program though that is able to compare vehicles with where they should be. So if, you have preventative maintenance, you're now better able to track each vehicle. I mean, I'm not trying to tell you what to say, but like that was my understanding, is you have better data on each vehicle, so you're now able to better maintain each vehicle.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's down to the minute. I mean, these vehicles are tracked from that perspective like they weren't before. Certainly, I think before we were driving maintenance by time, and that could you could end up pulling in a vehicle for maintenance that hasn't had sufficient hours to warrant one, and then other ones that may be past due, and that would of course be the most concerning. So we do have that data as well. Yes.
Go ahead, Dick.
So are we monitoring the uptime, lack of a better term, for vehicles, and what if anything are we learning?
You mean the utilization aspects?
Right. I mean, I know we do that in computers. The computers are up, 98, 99% of the time and so forth. Do we have a similar logging and tracking system and reporting mechanism for vehicles?
We do. We can monitor hours sometimes, but it's usually mileage. And the challenge is that sometimes vehicles, as I mentioned, they go to a point A to point B. They could be on site all day doing a job and the vehicle isn't utilized. So the trips may be 15 minutes in total between DPW and their work site for that day. So the utilization may seem low. However, it doesn't mean that it wasn't essential. It could be, the vehicle is being used on site. But we do have additional data for utilization. And I've talked to Dave as well as Karis and Cecilia and Bob Lewis about what our utilization standards should be. And usually when I question them, when I see them through the course of the year and I start thinking that a vehicle needs to be looked at closer, usually I find out that it's a special purpose vehicle that may be underutilized. So those are really the ones that mainly stand up in those cases.
I guess I'm encouraging that a disciplined look at that data to see if it suggests other practices than we're currentently following.
Yeah, I do kind of poke that a bit, probably more than a few times a year, asking these questions. Because you look at it as though you own it, and I don't think it's right to ask for a vehicle that I wouldn't open up my wallet and make that purchase for my business.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, so one of the things that I would say is we are going to be replacing many fewer vehicles in terms of numbers than we had anticipated for fiscal year 23. And while the amount is lower, those vehicles are just being pushed out. And I think that is one of the areas of analysis that Dave is doing with DPW in terms of what the vehicles are that are needed on an annual basis. And while we're adding to the fleet, we are extending the time that in between the replacement of other vehicles, and there may be vehicles that may not be quite right. And when it comes time for replacement, we'll be replacing them with something different from what it is that is currently owned by the town. But this is going to be like, this is a multi-year process. We're talking 10, 12 years to go through cycles with all of these vehicles.
I think also with regard to the push out of vehicles, we're starting to see the gains from the refurbishment program. So that's enabling some of these vehicles to be utilized for their full life expectancy versus going out of service earlier or needing higher levels of repair.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Jim, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Then given all this study that's being done, which all seems fantastic and research, then why would we consider adding a vehicle? I don't quite get that. Seems to me we would benefit more from getting all the research and the data before we make the decision to add another vehicle.
I think I know the answer, but John, go ahead if you want to answer.
Do you mean with regard to pushing some vehicles out, but then asking for an additional vehicle?
Well,
John,
you're asking for an additional vehicle. So yes,
So
Well, the pushing out, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, John, is that, I mean, some of these vehicles have already reached the end of their life and perhaps, were introduced long before these preventative maintenance programs were introduced. So some of these additional vehicles may be needed immediately and may not be able to wait until we have more information. Is that correct?
Yes, in some regard. But and then additionally, with regard to pushing some vehicles out, but asking for another, that doesn't, those vehicles are still utilized. The pushing out of a vehicle, it's still functional and could wait another year or two with some effort from sometimes the refurbishment fund.
I think that's my point, Josh. My point is, it seems to me that we may be premature in terms of deciding whether or not we should be adding vehicles when in the long term, we're actually maybe looking at extending vehicles. So that's my view. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, go ahead, John.
As a note, and I'm not sure that everyone's aware here, when I first arrived at DPW, there was a significant increase in the life cycles of the entire fleet and all classes of vehicles. Vehicles were being replaced at 6, 8, and 10 years, and we're out to 10, 12, and sometimes 15 years now.
Is there additional data, John, you can provide about how this additional vehicle will be serve the program, the programs of the DPW? So if there have been program expansions in recent years, that this vehicle will help support where there may not have been a need in prior years?
Yes, I could reach out to Parks and get that information.
Thank you. Does anyone else have other questions about the fleet program? Okay. Thank you, John. The next item on the agenda is DPW. Dave, would you bring in Karis and the rest of the team? I imagine there'll be other people along with Cecilia who'll be talking to that. In the meantime, I think Dick is going to be giving a summary presentation of the DPW budget request. You're on mute, Dick.
Yeah, I'll start this intro while people are.
Mr. Chair,
Hi,
may I
Dave.
just interrupt for a moment. Karis, who else do you want me to bring in to this?
I think to start off with, I'd bring in Barry Dulong. I think after that, it can kind of be topic specific. We can answer a lot of questions, but if we get down into the minutia, obviously we might want to pull more people in. So I would start with Barry because I know that building maintenance is going to be a focus of the conversation. And then if we can't answer questions, we can bring additional individuals in as well.
Very good. Barry's coming in.
Thanks, Karis. Welcome.
Okay, we've circulated a couple of charts showing the percentage increase in the proposed fiscal 23 budget, both without the DSR4 requests and with the DSR4 requests. And we'll start on the without DSR4 request, if you will, the basic budget request to start with. As a total, that's up $758,000 year over year to fiscal 22. The bulk of that increase is coming in the expense line versus the payroll line. Payroll's up a bit, and let me just briefly touch on the reasons for that. Essentially, it's a new classification and compensation study that went in such that not only is the base compensation going up, but that also has its impact on overtime as well. In addition, there is a switch of personnel. So the admin division picked up a person that came from the building maintenance division. So you see the building maintenance division is negative on payroll increase while the admin seems very high, but that's just really one body swinging that number that much. So I think the thing that makes sense is to spend the most time talking about the expense side of the budget. And to some extent, this is not really a discretionary item. It's reflects the fact that there has been dramatic inflation in a number of items. But let's sort of take them one at a time. In the admin division, there is some increase in the expense line attributable to a new system, order tracking system that's in there. The main increase dollars, oh, by the way, I meant to say that of the $758,000 in increases in expense, 3 divisions contribute almost 90% of that increase. Building maintenance contributes 336 or 54% of the increase. Highway, 193,000 or 25% of the increase. And recycling and solid waste is 140,000 or 18%. So those 3 divisions or departments, if you will, represent the bulk of the increase. Looking at the building maintenance division, the main drivers there are some HVAC increases, plus some increases in the costs for outside cleaning services. And Karis and her team have prepared a couple of slides on this area that I think would be informative. So Karis, why don't you run us through those slides with respect to building maintenance activities?
So I think when we, thank you. I think when we talked with both Dick and Louise, we discussed and focused really on building maintenance and specifically the increases on the HVAC side. So I think we're looking for this slide that just explains the last 3 years of HVAC expenditures.
There's a slide that starts with outsourced. Yeah, and then there's a couple of specific. Okay. Oh.
I think we might have passed it.
Yep.
There you go.
No.
Yeah,
no.
so no, it's I think 3 up from that.
Oh, this one?
Okay, that's as good a one as any.
Oh, do you want a different one?
Well, that was the one I was thinking of.
This one, yeah, outsourced, okay.
One
So
of
I
the
think
things, I was just going to say, Karis, one of the things, and I'm going to talk to this at the end of this segment. One of the things I think we need to do is to develop some guidelines as to how to measure the appropriate investment in maintenance. This is a first rough cut at it, but when we get to the end of this little segment, I'm going to suggest perhaps some other approaches, but go ahead, Karis.
Sure. So we are looking at increasing our investment in our maintenance costs for the HVAC in the town. I think there's a few things that are driving this, but I will be honest with you. I think the main driver of this has been COVID, whether it's COVID and how we've responded to it, or to be frank, the flaws in the way that we've operated our buildings that COVID has unmasked. And I say we, and I do not just mean the town of Needham, I mean industry-wide, how school building managers have maintained their buildings as far as the goal or the outcomes that they're looking for in their HVAC work. So effectively, our program, and I'm aware that most communities have operated the same way, have been operating our systems to failure, which basically means we replace something when it fails. What we have found during COVID is that that's no longer acceptable. People do not accept the fact that their heating system, particularly right now, their ventilation system, because that's sensitive, or cooling system is going to fail on them. They want us to do maintenance before it fails, which is obviously a different standard of maintenance and care. And this is something that Actually, the Ken Wertz, who's the head of the Mass Facilities Administrator Association, has been presenting about to towns across the state because it's not unique to Needham. So it sort of uncovered some issues about how we decide to maintain our schools, but also all of our HVAC systems. So if you look, I think it's the slide that has 2019, 2020, and 2019, 21, and 23 on it. Please.
Yep, look, that you just had it
One back.
there.
So this particular slide, I think, highlights the changes in the methodology. So if you look at 2019 and what the town invested in outsourced work, you'll see that we spent just over $300,000. If you look at what was spent really in 2021, not just to increase our ventilation, but really to make sure that our systems were functioning the way they really should be functioning to make our schools and our air safe. The town invested a fairly significant amount. Some of it was covered through CARES and through other emergency related items to help increase our airflow. But as far as just making sure that our systems were functioning, communicating correctly, and providing the appropriate, designed standards, we did have to do quite a bit of improvements in order to achieve those goals. And I would say, I think Needham has been highly successful in doing that and making sure that we provided safe environments for our employees and for our students to be in. And so really what we did when we put together our 22 budget, and now even more so as we look to 23, is really think about how to sustain that investment in our equipment. So one of the things we talked about, and it is counterintuitive, it is much more expensive to maintain a new building than it is to maintain an old building. Old buildings are very, very simple. And so there are fewer points of failure for them. They're not as good air quality wise. They have all these other issues, modulating temperatures and energy efficiency. But as far as maintenance goes, they are much more simple to maintain. Needham has invested a lot in its buildings, and we have a lot of new buildings, which means that these buildings per square foot are going to be more expensive for the town to maintain these complex HVAC systems. So the reason that we increased the budget, and one of the main drivers of this, is that Needham made the decision that we were going to outsource all of our filter changes in the town. So we had, since I started with the town 14 years ago, we had been using our custodial staff to do our filter changes, which was an economical way of doing it, but not in the short term, because it doesn't cost very much to have a custodian work overtime. We're on their regular shift to change out filters. But what we really found was we were missing a massive opportunity to have a trained professional evaluate these systems as they're conducting these changes. And so we found that there were certain things that a custodian would not have been trained to pick up, nor would we expect them to as part of their program. So part of the desire is we're now outsourcing all of our filter changes in our schools so that we will have professional HVAC technicians coming in and evaluating those systems when they come in, and they'll be generating additional concerns if they happen to see a belt that's torn or something mechanical inside that needs to be repaired. So that's one major change to the programs that we have in place. And I have Barry on as well, who can provide any follow-up information. The other thing I will just mention is the town, if we are fully staffed with HVAC technicians, has 3 technicians. And largely those technicians are firefighter technicians. So essentially they come in at the beginning of the day and they figure out what isn't working, and they dispatch either our staff or we dispatch contractors to those sites. Because if you think about it, 3 people, 2 of which work during the day, 1 who works at night, for all the buildings and all the square footage and all the rooftop units we have in town, really don't cover a lot of mileage on a day-to-day basis. So that's also one of the reasons why you'll see an increase on the outsourced component of our HVAC versus on the staff side. I say if we're fully staffed right now, we have 1 HVAC technician. We have posted and not received applicants for the additional 2, and we're going through a whole bunch of processes internally. And you'll see actually one of them in our DSR 4 to see how we can do a better job of recruiting individuals. But these industries are also just very competitive right now and hard to recruit for. So That's sort of the general overview. And again, I think what Dick had suggested, which is digging into industry standards and figuring out what our benchmarks are. If you see one of the things we did, just to put in context, the slide, 2 slides above this, Louise, is we looked at the value of the annual maintenance as it relates to the total investment of our assets. Just one of the conversations we've had with PVBC in the building design and construction division over the past 6 months, as we've been trying to really develop a stronger relationship with those divisions, is the town puts these buildings in place. We want to, first of all, make sure we're putting the right systems in place, and then also make sure that we're taking care of and maintaining those systems appropriately. So just for context into the value of the properties that we have, Cecilia actually put together a chart that just sort of shows the percentage of these properties that we're looking at investing in an annual basis to keep them running. So that's sort of my general overview, and I guess I would just take any follow-up questions about HVAC.
Thank you, Karis. I appreciate that. And I personally, I'm very convinced of the need to have additional maintenance. So I think this is a great endeavor. I want to just add one thing. I think on the next couple slides, that the previous slide that we were showing, I think there is just one more component that I think it's important to highlight, that there are HVAC supply costs. So I noticed in the budget that there are $137,500 in HVAC supplies for fiscal year 23. I'll go to questions. Louise, I saw your hand up.
So just 2, really. One is when we're looking at the outsourcing of the HVAC filter replacements, I think it might be helpful to compare what is the cost of our replacing the filters in-house, which seems to have been not very expensive, and then having an inspection of the HVAC systems versus having that outsourced. And then the second thing is, with respect to the recommissioning services, putting together a schedule of the buildings and when they will be recommissioned, I'm sorry. And that is something that is eligible for Green Communities grant funding. So I don't know what cycle we're on or for that funding, but recommissioning services are Green Communities grant eligible.
Yeah, I think I'd like just to chime in on top of Louise's comments, in that this is an area that it's hard for us as lay people to evaluate all this. On the other hand, we do need to look at this with not a critical eye or a skeptical eye, but a dispassionate eye, if you will, and make sure that the trade-off decisions that are being made make sense. And what I'm going to try to do over the next several weeks is try to do some research in the field to see what, if any, benchmarks might exist out there. Just doing some quick research today, there are 2 types of benchmarks that one could look at as a general proposition, and that is the percentage of the amount spent on maintenance relative to the capital value of the enterprise, or the other way of looking at it is it per square foot of building. So there are a number of types of standards out there that I think we can start to dig into and see which, if any of them, suggest a way of that will help this committee and help the DPW itself reach intelligent conclusions.
Karis, I have one other follow-up question. When you're looking at the trade-offs, I mean, obviously there's an economic trade-off between an in-house expertise and outsourcing, but I'm wondering if there's also a timeliness issue. So if you are moving to fully outsourcing your HVAC maintenance, in an environment such as this, where HVAC, maintenance professionals are in high demand, is the timeliness of the response of the outsourced entity as timely as if you had done this internally? And maybe you can comment on that.
So yeah, I can certainly speak to our current experience because as I mentioned, we have one HVAC tech, our building maintenance director, who is supposed to be spending a lot of his time, doing directing activities, to be frank, right now is doing a lot of his time doing HVAC work. We are reliant right now fairly heavily on our outsourced work. I don't think the goal is necessarily for outsourced. I think it's really a combination of the two. I think we need to have and maintain our own in-house staff so we can triage items, because oftentimes we're calling out a different vendor depending on the type of work. So if it's a controls issue, we would call our controls vendors. We have different controls vendors in different buildings, and in some buildings we have multiple controls vendors. So somebody in-house would know, oh, this is the vendor I need to call, or the other vendor, as they then move on to the next issue that we have in town and then triage that issue. What we're looking really at is how do we get enough service in order to serve the whole town? I will say, and I think Cecilia and Barry can also speak to this, that our current contracts have pretty strict requirements as to their response time. So I think they have to be in the town within 2 hours. I think it's fair to say we probably have at least one of our vendors in right now, almost 40 hours a week, as part of their regular service, responding to issues that we have in the buildings. And we haven't had real problems with response time in that regard. I'll also say it's a struggle with in-house versus outside experience. We have a lot of varied systems. I mean, we have buildings in town that are from the 1900s, and we have buildings in town that were literally built yesterday. So, and we have many different types of systems in different buildings. The advantage of the outsourced company is they oftentimes either have or can sub to a company that is certified or trained in the very specific type of chiller or type of rooftop unit that we have in each building. So for diagnostic purposes, our staff is excellent because they know how to triage items and how to troubleshoot. But when it comes to getting a certified technician on some of these products, it's been easier to go through a third party. So that has been an advantage as well. And again, like I said, we've also just really struggled in recruiting internally, but we're trying to work on how we can get more staff into the town to provide these services as well. So I think it's a partnership between the town staff and the outsourced staff in combination. Like you said, I don't think we could give up our own internal staff, because that triage work that happens at 5 a.m. before when all our systems come on, before kids come in or employees come in, is really critical. And I think outsourcing that would be really troublesome.
Thanks.
Karis, in your experience, is there a particular HVAC system that is less troublesome than others? So for instance, as we continue to build new buildings, can we focus on using that particular system, or can we look to maybe harmonize the types of systems that we use across all of our buildings?
So I think there's trade-offs. I don't know if there's one that's better or worse. I'm sure every technician has their preference. I think we have some very complicated systems in town that were installed for a variety of reasons, whether it's like noise issues. So sometimes these systems can be quite loud and disruptive to a classroom. Sometimes it's energy efficiency, and we want things to modulate a whole bunch, but that then requires a whole bunch of technology behind it. I think one of the things we've talked about is standardizing our control systems, which right now we do not have a fully standardized controls. So sometimes it is hard to tell when we have a problem where the problem is, because we have two different control systems that speak two different languages talking to each other. So I think standardizing is helpful. One of the things we've been working on for the past, this is a little longer than 6 months, but with the PVBC has really been having these conversations about involving building maintenance much more in depth in the design of these buildings. And then also I would say the PVBC is looking more from DPW to make sure we're maintaining the investments that they have. So we've been working collaboratively for the last 6 months, and we're not in a perfect place, but I think we're in a better place. I know Barry participates now in all of the public meetings as well as the behind the scenes work to weigh in on, trade-offs. Things may be cheaper on the front end that then may end up being more expensive on the back end. So providing that insight, I think, is helpful. So I think I don't have a quick answer for you, but I think DPW is going to be providing more insight in the future to help make those decisions.
I think that's great. Another question, does someone have to be in the building to identify a problem, or is there some sort of remote monitoring?
It depends on the problem. So I'll say right now, and Barry can certainly speak to it, I think his routine is right now, he wakes up at 5 a.m., he logs onto his computer and he can remotely see all the buildings in town and temperatures and airflow. Once he gets that information, so he may find out that one of our systems didn't turn on in the morning. It may be a technical issue where he can fix it from his computer, or it may be a mechanical issue that requires somebody to come in. So there's some remote work that we can do and some configuration and some changes and adjustments. And I don't know if you've been at town meeting. Well, you've all been at town meeting the last couple of years, and you'll notice that the temperature has been much more comfortable than in years prior. And that's literally Barry in the background adjusting dampeners and airflow. So we can do all of that remotely. So if someone's like a little cold, you can increase heat, or if you need more fresh air, you can increase that. But if the actual mechanical systems on the inside are not functioning, then no, we do have to go to the site. So there is more work we can do remotely than 20 years ago, but it's still an on-site process.
Thank you. Are there any other questions about HVAC specifically? Maybe just as kind of a segue, since HVAC is such a large proportion of the building maintenance budget, are there any unmet needs in other areas of building maintenance? So if we're talking about, roof or doors or, physical building structure, are there any unmet needs there?
So I think the facilities maintenance warrant article addresses a lot of those items. You will see when we discuss capital, there are a lot of capital items that we have recommended, some of which are fairly expensive and some of which are on buildings that I think of as new. I think of the Broad Meadow and Elliott as new buildings, but in the reality of a building life cycle, they're not. They're, certain things are coming to the end of their useful life cycle. So I think we do a pretty good job of that preventative work when it comes to the building systems themselves. What I will say is the town is currently transitioning. I think we've had a good work order system for building maintenance. I'm excited to roll something out DPW wide that's more comparable, but we're actually upgrading that system right now. We were in the process of the last year. We're IDing and asset tagging all of our mechanical systems, and we're going to be putting them into a predictive maintenance program. And that should help us in the future to better ascertain in advance where we think some of these cost pain points might be for larger systems. Roofs, rooftop units is a big one. They're just very expensive to replace and very time consuming to replace. And those items will be included in that program.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
I was around when Broad Meadow and Elliott came on board in the early 2000s. So that's about 20 years, 21 years. Mitchell's been there for 65 years. So when you talk about useful life, I think, you got to have a little bit more understanding and perspective. Thank you.
So I just want to speak to that a tiny bit, and it's just the systems that are in place in Mitchell versus the systems. And I'm not saying the systems that are in place in Mitchell are state of the art or doing the same thing that Elliott and Broad Meadow are, because they aren't. But because they aren't doing the same things, they actually tend to have a longer lifespan than some of these other systems that have more control, more functionality. They also tend to have more wear on them because they're modulating more and they're doing more work. So older systems tend to have a higher level of longevity than newer systems do.
John and I actually met with the school department yesterday, and they reported that the Mitchell HVAC systems actually give them the least problems of all their schools, which was surprising to hear. And I understand, like you said, Karis, that perhaps the efficiency or effectiveness may be different. But if there were some sort of middle ground where they could be as simple as the Mitchell, but as effective as the Williams, then that might be the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I don't buy any of that. Okay, that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo, if you ask me.
Let me suggest what might not be mumbo jumbo, which is a high degree of sophistication may give you all sorts of flexibility, but at a maintenance cost, it may not be worth that value. So I think it's got to be a value decision made on this versus new is always better.
And there also has to be some prioritization of what the ultimate goal is that we're trying to achieve.
Mhm.
But I think it's a topic, given that we're still going into years of building projects, it seems that this is something that we really need to focus on. And in planning for a new project, we always ask the question, what does the operating costs look like going forward? What's the operating issues of running this building? And I think the discussion is always given short shrift, frankly. And so I think as a finance committee, that's something that we need to hone in and focus on as well, because this is a recurring theme that we've seen in several buildings now.
Okay,
Go ahead, Dick.
shall I keep plodding away, Josh?
Sure. Louise, would you mind stop sharing your screen? I think, or do we need the slides?
Not for this one.
Okay.
Engineering is a relatively minor item in terms of the cost of the budget, and we'll be dealing with that in some depth on the DSR 4. So I suggest we skip the engineering for now. Fleet's the next item down on the slide. Fleet is primarily, this is just the maintenance costs associated with the fleet rather than the capital costs. And what's driving the costs here is cost of tires and other petroleum-based product. Highway is the largest single increase in expense on a percentage basis year over year. It's up 18%. And that's due to the asphalt and other petroleum-based products that are used. And the concern is that the estimates of between 20 and 30% increases may in fact prove to be light. Karis, you made some comments about that this afternoon. Might be helpful to just bring the committee up to speed on that.
So I think the question was, were the prices, like when Dick and I talked, it was, are the prices firm for next year? So the answer is yes, we have contracts in place. The issue is that there's asphalt and gasoline inflators in all of our contracts that are required by the state. So we have to put in inflators based off of those commodities. So what we did is we looked at our pricing. We bid our bids I think about a year ago, if not two for some of these. And we looked at the current market of our neighboring communities and what they were getting. And that's where we calculated the 30 to 40% inflation. We did go conservative. We had conversations internally about what we thought was acceptable. And we took a conservative estimate on our end and went lower on that percentage when it came to the individual items. I think knowing that we may have to have a conversation if something happens in the market and it goes, if gas and diesel go up even higher than they are currently, we may have to come back and have a conversation about looking for more funds.
As this afternoon to Karis, conservative may not be the appropriate term there, because conservative coming in with lower estimates, it may be that we have to go higher than that. And so the conservative might have been to err on the high side and be able to dial it back. But the concern is that these numbers are still subject to change.
Go ahead, Liz.
So if I may, so one of the, I think something that is being highlighted by the DPW budget request is that we are seeing inflation in a lot of different areas, and DPW is being hit particularly hard by inflation. I don't think that we're therefore going to be able to simply say, well, inflation is 30%, therefore we need to increase these expense budgets by 30%. I think one of the things we're going to need to have an understanding of is, if we can only increase by 5%, which is the normal increase or whatever our normal increase is, then what does that mean in terms of the services that are being provided? And I think that's going to be something that's very important for us to understand as we move forward, because we are going to see that inflationary pressure on a number of different budgets. It just happens to be particularly evident right now with DPW.
Very valid. Okay, let me just try to drive through the rest of the base budget. Parks and Forestry, again, what's driving the costs there are outside mowing and mulching contracts. And then the last item in this introductory or base budget is the recycling and solid waste. There's a lot of moving parts, as we always know, in this particular budget. This year, there are two significant impacts. One is Dedham has closed down part of its solid waste activity, so that's pouring over into Needham, which is changing the volumes for the Needham operation. And then secondly, there is a lot of let me rephrase that. The recycling market is very dynamic due to supply chain issues and what is and isn't happening in China. And I have now totally more than exhausted my command of the subject. I'm going to turn it over to Karis.
So what we saw last year was actually a return to some receipt of revenue for our recycling commodities, which we had not seen in the past few years since China cut off basically the recycling market from the United States. We think there's a couple reasons for this, and we've seen it sustain. So it wasn't just for a month or a little anomaly. One reason is that there are companies, a lot of them that are Chinese-based, that are investing in the United States that are going to be processing materials domestically. So that way they don't have to worry about the recycling ban, the recycling import ban in China. And then secondly, COVID, because their materials are more difficult to obtain, and therefore reusing materials may become more cost beneficial than using new materials. There's been a secondary market for most of our materials. And again, we've seen it change. We actually, a few months ago, saw revenue for our single stream, which I never thought we would see. That tends to be a cost across the board. But the value of some of the materials in that single stream, like cardboard, was so high that we were actually receiving revenue. Right now, it's moderated a little bit. We're not seeing as much revenue. We're not seeing revenue for every commodity. Some items we're seeing revenue. Some items we're seeing a cost. Right now, we're at a net positive for the processing. We still pay a hauling fee. So that is it's still a net cost to the community. It's just that cost has been decreased over the last year and a half.
There are a number of slides which I think are informative that perhaps you could run through those slides. Or perhaps not. Here we go.
So Louise, I think if you go to the third of my slides, so slide number 6.
No, whoops, you've gone too far.
I'm sorry, which one did you want?
So I think if you get slide number 6.
I don't have them numbered like you do.
Oh, no, if you see on the side of your screen, it has a number.
Oh, okay.
So I think that it just shows one of the items that Dick had mentioned was the increase in our commercial waste. So you'll see that there's an increased fee for processing MSW because we're processing, or we anticipate in processing more in 23 based on our experience since the Dedham facility closed. But we are taking in revenue to offset that additional cost. So I think that was just trying to show that while we are paying a fee to dispose of the waste that we're receiving.
Is that the next slide, slide 7?
Slide 7 is comparing our revenue with our budget. So just showing that they are sort of operating.
Can someone explain to me what the whole Dedham thing is? What's going on?
Dedham had a large commercial transfer station that took waste in from haulers, contractors, other commercial generators. and they closed their facility down. They no longer process trash. So those operators, some of which are from Needham, were looking for another location to process their trash. Needham actually has a fairly high permit for our transfer station. We don't use anywhere near our current capacity. So we've taken in additional commercial vendors. I will say we are now turning some commercial vendors away because the interest was so high. There's obviously an advantage to a hauler or a construction company to be able to
So the
take their
revenue,
materials close
So
by.
we must be making a good deal of revenue, right? I mean, for these people to come into our facility and to be able to use our facility, we probably could charge a premium since, Dedham's out, right?
We could. We do charge more for our commercial customers than we do for our residential. And so you'll see that reflected in our revenue. But yes, we can charge a higher fee for commercial.
I mean, this should be a positive. I mean, this is a benefit to us, right?
Yeah, I think we got to look closely at whether the costs are being fully covered and hopefully more than fully covered here.
So if they're not, we should be charging more.
Exactly.
I mean, we've got a captive audience. They can't go to Dedham anymore. I don't know where else they would go. They're coming to us. That's fantastic. So let's just charge them as much as we possibly can within reason. And that's what I would do. I don't know. This seems to, the way the presentation was going is it sounded like it was a negative. There was a
No,
drag.
it wasn't meant to be a negative.
Okay, so I think that's a positive.
Hey, Karis, do you know our rates relative to if you just took a survey of, I don't know where the other, 5 nearest facilities are, where we stand?
I don't, but we can do that.
I see Dave has his hand up. Do you have an answer to that?
Yes, the Needham, first off, the rate that we are charging at $140 a ton is actually a net gain to the town. It does cover the cost, and actually we had held it at the 140 for several years now because we were the most expensive one in the area. But in terms of the analysis of the rate structure, that is providing in effect a subsidy to the other users of the RTS. We'll be doing the next survey in terms of rates, just in terms of where we are in the marketplace this spring, when we make a determination of to the board, to the select board, whether the rate should be amended upwards or not. But as of the last analysis, which is about 18 months old, we were getting about a 20% premium, or in other words, 20% over cost at 140 from those commercial operators. They also pay a permit fee, unlike all residents, which have free access to the RTS. The only complication is, of course, this is, as Mr. Healy mentioned, this is a benefit and a plus, but as folks know, unfortunately, revenue doesn't go directly to cover the cost of the operation. You have to appropriate the expense, and then the revenue comes in. When the revenue estimates for FY23 are done, and they'll be out in a few more weeks, I'll be increasing the revenue estimates in trash disposal, representing the fact that we have a higher volume.
I think that's great, Dave. And I think we have an opportunity here. It may not be a large sum of money, but at least it's a positive in our way. I would not want to, damage any one of our Needham people to the extent that we have, organizations and corporations that are doing work who are residents of our town and already paying taxes. But to the extent that other people are going to come into our town and use our facility, I think we should be paying whatever the fair market value is, and make sure that we get whatever the appropriate revenue is that we should get.
Tom,
just a quick question. Do we have an idea what the commercial property in Dedham was charging before they closed? I'm just wondering if we're giving it, if we're at that similar rate, because obviously they're able to absorb that. You don't need an answer right now, it's just something to check out.
Thanks, Tom. That'd be helpful information.
Okay.
Dick, do you want to move on to other
Yeah,
subjects?
that's all I had on the base budget. I think the issue is what Louise raised, even though given the fact that these costs are inflation driven, that doesn't mean that automatically we've got to accept all of them. It may be that some hard decisions need to be made and say, how much of this can we afford? But assuming this is basically in the school department lingo, same service delivery, is looking at an overall increase of almost $800,000.
So Dick, one of the things that begs the question here is we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 12 months with respect to inflation and with respect to what the government's response to it is going to be. I mean, if we were that smart, we wouldn't be on this Zoom. We'd be out making money somewhere else. But my question is, at some point, do we take a position where we give some credence to that component of what the budget might be and the impact on the budget, but then put some monies into the reserve fund that would allow for the transfer of monies in the event the situation becomes as dire as we might think? And so I raised that.
I think that's a very good point, Jim. In lieu of every department creating a contingency fund, maybe one contingency fund and set up in a reserve account to cover what is likely to be inconsistent inflation impact.
Louise, go ahead.
So, Jim, you just opened up the door for my favorite topic, reserve funds, which I actually think we already have a hefty reserve fund. And if we were to go that route, I think that would make perfect sense, given how we have budgeted in the past and where we are with the reserve fund. And I'll save my reserve fund discussion for another day.
Okay.
We're still working on public works.
With your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I'll suggest we move to the DSR4.
That sounds good.
And here, unlike the case, if you will, with the base budget, which is driven by external forces and arguably is not as discretionary here, excuse me. I managed to hit a button there I shouldn't have hit. These are all, if you will, discretionary items in that they would each require an affirmative decision. Yes, this is an additional activity or function that we should engage in. The fact that they are discretionary doesn't mean that they aren't worthy of being implemented, but it seems to me there's a different thought process and a different discipline brought to bear on this. So I'm going to suggest that Karis walk through the 10 or so items that are in the DSR4 request list.
And maybe we can pause after each one for questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
So I think building off of what Dick said, I think there are some that are more memorializing either changes that have been made or changes we would like to continue to make. And then I think there are items that we have that deal with potentially capacity when it comes to capital projects or other outside services. So the first one we have is a more straightforward one, which is the cleaning of the public safety building on weekends. Our old fire station number 2. I don't think we provided much cleaning services, if any cleaning services to that particular structure. We've provided more cleaning services because of COVID to that building. And we've had a request that we continue providing weekend services to that building moving forward as it now has a new facility. The budget that we have put forward is just to increase overtime for the weekends to provide that service.
And so, Karis, when you said continuing this, when did this service first begin?
So we started providing cleaning during COVID.
Okay.
For fire station 1. I'm sorry, for fire station 2.
And would this DSR4 support both Fire Station 2 and the headquarters?
We had built into the base budget, I think, as part of Dave's pro forma on the addition of those buildings coming online in fiscal 22, the addition of a custodian at Fire Station number 1 and 2 at the public safety building, which includes Fire Station 1 and the police building. This would just be providing supplemental services on the weekends. I'm sorry, this is for all of the buildings for public safety, not just for the Fire Station number 2. So we built into the base budget the weekly service. We just haven't built into it the overtime for the weekend work.
And is there currently any weekend service at Fire Stations 1 and the police, well, soon to be police station?
There has been since COVID started. We've been providing additional sanitization and cleaning.
Okay. Rick.
Curious, is this going to be a permanent thing? Or will your schedule change and so you'll assign people to those facilities on a regular basis and it won't be overtime?
Right now, the vision wasn't to have like a rotating shift of custodians who would work not Monday through Friday. I think we only have that at one facility right now, which is the library. And they function the same way that the librarians do, where they rotate a Friday on a Saturday. And they get paid for overtime on Sundays. So it was not envisioned that this would be part of a regular shift and this would continue to be done on overtime in the future. And that the service would continue outside of the pandemic.
So I don't mean to pick on firefighters, but I do. So I understand the need for cleaning services during COVID, but firefighters and fire have always cleaned their own fire stations. So I think I'd like to find out a little bit more why there would be a change in what they do.
And I'm sure their
Yeah,
mothers
what?
trained them to pick up after themselves, right?
Well, I know at least one firefighter who should be. No, but that
He's
is
gonna-
part of what they
that
do. I mean,
That poor one firefighter is now going to be cleaning the whole goddamn fire for the next 5 years.
But you know, they're on, I mean, this is something that has always been part of what they do. They do chores as part of their job. So, you know, I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but just questioning the need.
Carol, did you have your hand up?
No, sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
Any other questions about this
Just think this is
DSR4?
not a big dollar item, but it's also maybe not a compelling case either.
So
Can
Karis, I guess if you
ask
can, go ahead, John.
Are these in the order of priority or that from
Was it number
DPW
one?
is they're listed, or we're just,
This is
there a priority?
one.
So this is their highest priority?
It's listed as priority 1. This is on
Okay.
tab 13, page
So as we
222.
go through, for example, so this, we take this as their highest priority.
That's hard to imagine, John, that
Yeah.
could be the case.
Right, that's why I
Well,
asked the
some-
question.
There's some compelling ones as we go down the list.
Right, that's why I asked the question. The order of it seems strange to me.
Right.
Karis, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think the reasoning behind why it was 1 is typically when we have items that are associated with new buildings coming online or expanded infrastructure, we tend to prioritize those higher than with items that are with existing infrastructure. That was why it received a higher priority.
Mr. Chair,
Rick, go ahead.
Curious, if this wasn't approved or it wasn't added to the overall budget, how would that work get done?
I mean, I think to Louise's point, it would be not cleaned on the weekends and it would be up to the occupants of the building to maintain those spaces.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tom. Oh, you're on mute. Tom, you're on mute.
Kara, can you help me understand how many hours of weekend cleaning would this cover? $17,000.
Cecilia has the breakdown for you if you just wait one moment.
It's 4 hours on Saturday and 4 hours on Sunday
At each
at
building?
each location. Sorry.
So 8 hours each day?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Josh, this brings up a very interesting issue that I raised a couple of weeks ago when I was meeting with Dave Davison on some finance department issues. And I recall that back in the day, and of course that's a long, long day for me, there used to be a prioritization that was done, as John Conley mentioned, but not just within a particular department. There was a prioritization that was done for the town. And as we look at the DSR4s, have we ever asked the town manager or the Board of Selectmen to give us a prioritization of where they think their DSR4 extra funds might be able to go in the event that there was the ability to do so, and in the event that there was a justification for doing so?
But let me know if I've misinterpreted your question. I think we usually rely upon the town manager to give, so these are budget request submissions, and then the town manager will put together her budget recommendations, which may include all, some, or none of the DSR4s. So I think we typically rely upon the town manager as a preliminary filter, the town manager's recommendations.
But my point is, even within that, there's no prioritization. The town manager is giving to you a group of DSR4s that she is requesting to be funded. There's no prioritization as to whether this one is more important than number 2 or number 3, number 4, number 5.
They're prioritized within departments, but not across departments.
Yeah. So, I'm not trying to make work for anybody, but I do believe that it would be beneficial to the finance committee to know what it is that is the priority of the town. In the event there are additional funds that are available, in the event there is sufficient justification shown, what is would they like those monies to be spent? In the old days, we literally would be a list from 1 to 30, and I don't think we have the benefit of that right now. And by the way, the finance committee historically is not beholden to whatever that list is. It may be that we think that number 6 was more important than number 1 for whatever reason, but I just find it hard to kind of shoot in a barrel as to what is it that the town really, really wants. And I think John Conley brought up a great point. This can't be the number 1 priority of DPW with respect to DSR4.
So I think in the past we have had discussions with the town manager, perhaps differences of opinion about prioritizations. That's always tends to be at a later date after the town manager's recommendations have come out. So I think it's fair to say that this is still just an early conversation. This is just based upon the budget request. So I think there's more discussion to come. And I take your point, Jim. I think, yes, there is room for more granularity in the DSR4s across departments. But I think right now it might be too early to get to that. Any other comments about this particular DSR4? Okay, why don't we move on to the next one?
So the next item I have, I'll just give a brief introduction, and then I'm actually going to pass it on to Cecilia to provide more of the detail. But this would be an additional position that would sit in our highway department of a laborer 3 position. Going back some number of years, and I can't recall, although I did find the memo in Rick's office discussing this, the highway department actually had 2 additional FTEs than it currently does. And as part of a reorganization, and also I think as part of a particularly tough budget year, it ended up, I think one of the positions I think ended up getting sort of reallocated to solve multiple issues in another division, and then another position was eliminated. This request is actually, it's a multi-year request. This is the first of the 2-year requests to try to restore our highway division back to a staff of 12. There's sort of 2 functions for this. One has to do with our snow and ice operation, and the other one has to do with our day-to-day operations in the summer, spring, and fall. And I'll give Cecilia the floor to be able to provide more detail.
Yeah, so currently there's 10 union staff in highway. 1 is solely dedicated to traffic. And then in the summer, 1 of the working foremen goes over and completely manages all of the outsourced contractors and keeps, coordinates with them, which leaves about 8 left. And a lot of the summer work that highway does, so milling and paving requires basically 2 separate construction crews of about 4 to 5 people each in order to be successful, as does the surface treatment work that they do. And with only 8 staff, that means all of their staff are fully out there and they can't address any of the other issues that come up, any of the see-click fix that comes in, any of the work order system. It also means that if one person is out on vacation or sick, they can't continue with any of their major construction projects. They can't go out and mill and pave a road because they don't have the full 2 construction crews that are required. They do not like to send just one sole individual out for most of the work that they do because it is a safety concern. And so any type of work usually requires about 2 to 3 people for small projects and then 4 to 5 for others. The milling and paving in particular, there's basically one crew that goes and does the milling, and then the second crew is directly behind them at the same time, following them up with the paving. And then the same with the surface treatments, that there's one crew that is removing the asphalt and another one is that is laying the new asphalt down. It's very effective this way, but without a full complement of staff, it does slow down the process and it does prevent the highway division from doing any other work. And then just with the snow program, especially now, we're seeing we need more staff, more qualified CDL drivers in order to effectively plow the town. And so any additional staff that are in highway would have their CDL and would enable us to better service the town in the winter months. And additionally, the highway division right now is the only division in DPW that does not have an entry point. It starts above the laborer 2 and laborer 3 positions, which are the entry level into the division. And so it is hard to find people to grow within highway without being able to bring in an entry level employee.
I'll just add one, additional item onto that, which is the snow and ice. So it hasn't been fully vetted yet, but I have proposed to the select board the potential of adding a 7th sidewalk route into the town for snow clearing. This would be a route that would effectively take care of our commercial areas as well as our transit areas. So it would go down Chestnut, down Highland, all the way to Newton, depending on the new infrastructure that's being constructed as part of the TIP. So we're looking at this as a 7th route that would require an additional body within DPW to be able to staff that particular route. So it has been a goal of the select board to expand sidewalk clearing, particularly in the downtown area. And this would be an opportunity to do that as well.
So Karis and Cecilia, are there, well, I guess 2 questions. How many current labor 2 and 3 positions are there, and how many current vacancies of those positions are there?
Think across all divisions?
No, specifically to this highway division.
So highway has no labor positions. It starts as an HMEO, mostly because of the nature of their work. They do work with a lot of heavy equipment, and they needed all of their 10 staff to be fully certified for hoisting licenses so they can function in our salt shift program. So that was a high level of importance. What that has done, though, is, I think to Cecilia's point, reduce the amount of entry point. DPW wide, right now we have 2 laborer 2 positions that are vacant that are currently posted. We are finding that most of the individuals that we are recruiting do not have a CDL license. And starting next month, it's actually going to get harder for individuals to obtain a CDL license. Right now, you just need to go with a piece of equipment and pass a test. So it requires skill and training, but there's no formal program. Starting in February, the state is actually mandating that you have a certain number of contact hours and professional training before you go take that test, which is going to make it even harder for us to find drivers in the open market. So I think our idea is that we would be able to recruit more people at the laborer level, get them trained up, and they'd be able to take opportunities as they open up, which they are quickly right now, in other areas of the DPW and HMEOs and crafts workers and other positions that do require more licensure. I'll also add the entry point to DPW historically, so for a very long time, was our summer program. And we were able to accomplish a lot of these goals through that program. I'm not sure, I can't predict what's going to happen this year, Pre-COVID, we were having difficulty filling all of the roles in our summer program. I'll be frank with you, the people we were filling them with, for the most part, we're not looking at careers in public works. As we have seen historically, we have a lot of our staff actually started here as summer help. And it used to be an extremely competitive program where we were actually rejected a lot of people from it. It's not that program anymore. It's really hard to find people. Last summer, I believe we openly posted several times for our summer help. And we got, I think, 4 or 6 people for 15, 19 vacant positions. So we're just having difficulty finding people through our traditional avenues of recruiting into public works. And so we feel like creating these opportunities at the lower end of our organizational chart may also help us to create individuals who have longevity within the community and build up their careers through all the different levels that we have.
Thanks. Go ahead, Rick.
Maybe more a comment and then a question. A comment, Kiris, would it be advantageous to take a current employee and teach them to that new certification level so they can drive? Because I understand the issue you might have in summertime. So first is, can you use it as a promotional or an increase in skill set tool, number one? And number two, is there a list of all the projects that won't be able to be started because this position isn't filled? And is there a list of said? And I think maybe we should have the opportunity to see what would be set aside in earnest if this thing wasn't filled.
So related, so every employee of DPW, when they become a full union member, is required to have a commercial driver's license. What we have done when we've hired laborers is we have allowed them 6 months to obtain that license. Occasionally, we've had to extend it to a year just based off of difficulty getting access to training, particularly during COVID. So every person is required to have a CDL. We actually have an individual internally who is pursuing a trainer certification so they can then train staff to get these licenses, so we don't have to send them to a third-party school, which does, it is a considerable cost. So that will be savings and help us to be able to improve one individual who works for us and help us train others within our staff. So every individual is required to obtain a commercial driver's license to participate in DPW as a full employee.
May I have a follow-up question before you jump to my second? In terms of the potential cohort of people who have that said license, how many have it and how many don't in terms of your staff?
I think I have one individual who is on probation who is required to get it. We've tried hiring at higher levels crafts workers, obviously not heavy motor equipment operators, individuals without CDLs. To be frank, they haven't worked out. We found that at the higher levels, it really isn't a bare minimum requirement for the positions. So there's one individual that I'm aware of that we have who needs to obtain their commercial driver's license.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
I think so. My basic thing is if you have 12 people, how many of those 12 don't have what you need? And are you moving to train or do whatever you need to do when you've answered the question?
And then the second question is, I think I can dig in and get you some more information about what does or doesn't happen. One of the things our highway department does is we do a lot of our prep work in-house for our construction work. So essentially when we do an overlay or we do a surface treatment, we do all the work in the road in advance to make that road look really nice and even and fill in holes and deal with drainage issues and shape the road basically before that overlay comes in. And it's one of the reasons we really feel that contractors like working in Needham because it makes it very smooth when they do a work. They don't have to come in and do the prep work. They just come in and lay down their product. And then secondly, we think that there's a huge cost efficiency there because we're not paying for them to do that. So we tend to think we get a strong price. What I can certainly do is we can look at last year and what we think we could have accomplished with 2 teams of 4 as opposed to 1 team of 8 and what that would have meant in terms of road miles for the various applications we have.
I think that would be helpful.
Yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions about this DSR4?
Josh, just one quick follow-up. Just Did you say you're gonna look for another laborer 3 in next year to bring you to full complement of where you were previously?
I think, and I will double check that we put in, we created a new form with Dave this year because we know that we'd like to create new forms.
It's an HMEO position next time.
And it's a future DSR4 form that I think we have submitted this year.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, what's HMEO stand for?
Heavy motor equipment operator.
Thanks. Okay, should we move on to the next one?
Yeah. Karis, perhaps this number 3 might be linked with, is it number 9 on your list?
Is this the survey party chief?
Yeah, well, it's in the engineering, and then there's an administrative assistance for engineering in 9, and I'm raising the question. Let's talk about one position rather than 2. As a general observation, if you go have a chance to look back at the basic documents, it looks like we've been under investing in the engineering division for the last several years, and all the other divisions have had dramatic increases in cost, and engineering seems to be lagging behind. And as you'll hear, this may be an opportunity to build up the professional competence in this division. Go ahead, Karis.
So I'll say, and I mentioned this to Dick and Louise, it's really hard to have this conversation without Tony here, to be frank, both, professionally and personally. So when we were developing the budget this year, and for the last year since I've taken on the role of director, Tony and I had lots of conversations about capacity in our engineering division. I think there's a few things that have been going on over the past few years that we've seen in DPW, and none of them are bad. They just have resulted in a bit of a bottleneck in our engineering division. One is that we've had resources in the community to really invest in the infrastructure, which is amazing and great for the community, but almost every piece of infrastructure that we do in one way or another ends up running through our engineering division, if not being run by our engineering division. So there's a lot of work in advance of projects before we see them, before they're ready to put forward for construction, that the engineering division does. And then a lot of work that is done during our construction phases. So what we had found, and I've had many conversations with, is that we had certain projects that were behind. They'd taken longer than a year in order to execute. We had funds that we had received from outside sources, grants, and other opportunities. Again, all amazing opportunities for the town, but these things ended up taking away resources from our engineering division. Additionally, the town has had quite a bit of growth in the last decade, and all of their site plan reviews, all of the work that's done for planning board and other commissions in town also gets funneled through our engineering division and requires their resources. So effectively what this has meant is that some of our projects have ended up getting pushed back and delayed. So one of the things I've been trying to work on in the last year is what can we do to get these projects back on track, so that when I'm coming for funds to the town manager and to the finance committee for capital, that I can show that we're expending these funds in a timely fashion. And one of the things that kept on coming up in those conversations was capacity. So there just simply wasn't enough man hours within our own internal division to be able to do necessary survey work, inspection work, and design work. So the 2 positions that I had talked to the former engineer about adding, and I'm going to use one of them looser because it may end up shifting, just because the new direction may end up shifting a little bit. But the survey party chief is also called an inspector. So it serves both functions. It does both survey work, but it also does a lot of construction inspection in our summers. And if we're doing 4 or 5 or 6 projects in the town, and right now we only have 2 inspectors, they're being torn between a lot of different projects in the community, as well as doing their regular survey work. So this first position, and the reason that it's more higher priority, is because this is one of the bottlenecks that we have for getting work accomplished in the summer, is really making sure that we have enough people to be able to oversee appropriately all these projects that are occurring, to make sure that we're getting good infrastructure and good investment, and we're not running into problems later on. So that's why this particular position is prioritized higher. And we talked about titles, and maybe titles need to shift. They're sort of old antiquated titles that may not necessarily make sense. Our priority number 9 is an admin analyst role. Do you want me to talk about that, Dick, or do you want to talk about that separately?
Yeah, well, no, I think I think maybe we got one position out of this, so make your case.
So the second position would be an admin analyst role. I'll say how it was envisioned and then where it may flex a little bit. It was envisioned as the second bottleneck is really on the contract review process and design review process when we're dealing with engineers. One of the conversations I had with the town manager about this bottleneck was this idea like we could just outsource it, right? So we can just hire more engineering firms. The reality is we hire a lot of engineering firms to do our design work. There's a few problems with relying on engineers to exclusively do our design work. One is that right now, every single firm we deal with has quality control deficiencies, I'll call it. So they are not providing the same level of review, and certainly not the level of review that our former town engineer would have expected before items are ready to go out to bid. So it does require, even though you may have an engineer from an outside firm doing 90% of the design work, it still requires 10% of the design work to occur from the town. The second issue is that there seems to be, and this is a concern I have in backfilling any role that requires a PE in our engineering division, there is not a lot of individuals out there right now who have civil engineering backgrounds who are looking for work. We're finding that our engineering firms right now are have a lot of work. They don't necessarily have a lot of staff. The same retirement waves that we're seeing, they're seeing as well. So we're finding that they don't have necessarily even the capacity to take on all this additional work that we're sending to them. So those are sort of the concerns about providing another position. Originally, when I talked to Tony about this was sort of envisioned as a someone who would work with our contract administrator. I think there's some conversation, and we've had conversations, I had them with Tony as well, about potentially bringing in a civil engineer position. When Cecilia and I took a look after meeting with Louise and Dick at the pay differential, they're one step between, and it's a $3,000 difference on the top end. So what might change in our request, should the town manager decide to fund that position or in her budget, is we may end up changing that to a civil engineer. The dollars though would not change. It would simply be the position that would change. So that's something we're currently exploring as we're sort of dealing with this transition process.
So here's, I have a question. If the on the survey party chief, correct me if I'm wrong, this is for town-owned lands only, and for building a project associated with those town-owned lands. How much do you anticipate that this will be getting through the backlog of surveys that haven't been able to be done so far? And how much do you anticipate it to be recurring year to year once that backlog has been gotten through?
So,
go ahead.
Dick?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is the title is deceptive. I don't think we're really talking about a survey party chief in the context you're raising the issue, Josh.
Okay.
Elaborate, would you please, Louise? Gareth, rather.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me why I'm wrong. Thank you.
So I don't think the primary or the only function of this position is going to be to conduct surveys. And I don't know if Tom is on, who could provide a little bit more detail about the day-to-day work, but I believe the type of survey work, I know we have a DSR-5 or a capital, I can't remember, for an ongoing survey request. This would not be to do that work. That work is done separately. This is really to go before we do a project in-house. They're the ones who do the markings. They're the ones who do topographical surveys, so not necessarily just property surveys. And then they're the ones who do a lot of the contract oversight in the field. So they're the ones who go and they make sure that when they're digging, they're not damaging our sewer when they go in to install new drainage work, for example. Or they're the ones who are making sure that they're backfilling and compacting to our specification before they complete a trench. So I agree. I think the titling is also a little bit misleading, and we'll have to talk about that internally as we move forward.
So is there some overlap in the functions with in overseeing contractors' work and making sure that they're not disrupting town infrastructure? Is that work that is done in building maintenance and construction as well?
So the work that's done, we have one position that's effectively dedicated to this. And I think we have a line item in our expense budget under engineering that we also outsource this work, just because Eversource is doing so much work in town. I think that's maybe the main one, but we have individual contractors who come in all the time and add in sewer and water connections as well. That is done through our street inspector, and that's a civil engineer position. So we have one FTE that's effectively dedicated to that work.
And I wonder if the building department also, it kind of overlaps with their role as well in inspecting things. Louise, you disagree?
No,
It
no,
does.
yeah.
Okay.
It does and it doesn't. I think one of the nice things is we have a new permitting software that we use that's all in one. So we now have connectivity between building and engineering, which we didn't before. So that's a much bigger benefit, but they're not looking at what happens in the road and how they protect our infrastructure, our sidewalks, our roads. They're really focused on the building and making sure the building is safe for the occupants.
Okay.
Yeah, there really is no overlap between the two. They complement each other.
Thank you. Are there other questions about this survey party chief and then also the priority 9 position? Okay. Dick, I guess the next DSR 4 is the HVAC supervisor, priority 4. Karis or Dick, do you want to talk about that?
So this is DPW trying to creatively solve a problem. I think I mentioned we've gone out several times right now, HVAC technicians, and we have not had any applicants. To the point, I think last applicant round, we had 5 applicants, none of which were really fully qualified to what we would expect, and we got no calls back for interviews. So that market is a very hot market. One of the things I will say, I've mentioned before about how our building our building maintenance director is in the system a lot, is that most people who go into facilities management start in HVAC. So they tend to be the people who are interested in the holistic systems of a building. So they tend to go into be interested then in growing their knowledge and then becoming facilities directors down the line. So sort of the thought was, how do we capture somebody who's like our building maintenance director, but earlier in their career, so that way our building maintenance director doesn't have to deal with all the controls in particular on the building, but then also managing all of our HVAC contractors, whether it's controls, whether it's mechanical. So the idea was to create a new position to consolidate all of our HVAC under one supervisor, which would be classed the same as we have shift supervisors that oversee our trades or oversee custodians, the one for the day and one for the night. And the idea would be to carve out the HVAC, so our 3 HVAC techs, and then also all of our on-call work and all of our controls work, and consolidate that under this position. Part of it is because we know that the salaries that we have for our HVAC are not necessarily competitive, and certainly not competitive for somebody with controls experience, because you're almost looking for computer engineering types as opposed to somebody who is going to go out and go crawl around in ductwork. But also because we know that the kind of person who's looking at growing their career might be interested in this type of middle opportunity to sort of have a stepping stone as part of their career to become a facilities manager. So we may decide to reclassify an existing HVAC tech before the budget process, because we can't, to be frank, continue to function forever with our building maintenance director performing this level of detailed work and having only one technician in on a day. And we need to figure out a way to be more desirable for potential applicants. So this is something we've been thinking of, but we wanted to get it as part of the budget process as well, because we also knew how important it is for the town. And I think going back to all of the costs that we talked about on the expenses side, to make sure that we're effectively and appropriately managing our HVAC.
Yeah, I would encourage you on that latter point, given the complexities of the system, the capital commitment we've made to it, and then the maintenance costs, I think we've got to make sure that we are managing this process well. And if in looking at it, we don't have the personnel who are capable of stepping up to that level, then I think we've got to consider how we should go about doing that, because it's a pretty significant investment that we need to manage.
Any questions about this DSR4? Okay, the next one, priority 5, is the administrative analyst.
So I'll give a little introduction. And again, I'm going to pass this on to Cecilia, who's done some more digging after our conversation with Rick and Louise, just to provide more context for the position. But I will say, even though this seems like a new request, it's actually a repeat DSR4 from the past several years. We have historically put in for a fleet service and parts manager in order to try to provide some additional services for our fleet division. Right now, we have one manager who functions in that division, managing all of our assets, as well as providing guidance for other equipment across the town. The responsibilities in the last 5 or so years have increased, and additional support in order to keep the high level of service is necessary. We had heard feedback in prior meetings about looking at a potential different avenue to go. So we had talked about a parts and services manager. And we found one of the benefits of the comp and class study is now that every single position in town is on one scale. They're easy to see where everybody fits together. And what we found was the fleet and parts manager that we were looking for also fit into the same scale as an admin analyst. So we actually worked with the fleet supervisor and really looked at the items that were under his current supervision role that were providing him high task time, and figuring out how to move that to a different role. So I think Cecilia can provide a little bit more of a breakdown of the tasks specifically that this individual would be doing, and then also what that day-to-day would look like for that position.
Yeah, so this position would be responsible for a lot of, like we had mentioned before, the parts and services. We're looking at, did a really rough markup of about what a typical week and how much they would spend, or a typical month and how much time they would spend for each of the tasks. And we found about 50% of it would be sourcing fleet parts and repairs, including purchasing and research, and then maintaining the records for the vehicle. So including updating Fleetio, which is our fleet maintenance software, with all of the maintenance, repairs, parts ordering that's happening, making sure that everything is up to date in a very timely manner in Fleetio. And then another about 25% would be scheduling inspections and repairs, and then confirming information for payment of invoices. So that's not necessarily going into the system and paying the invoice. It's making sure that we're receiving the correct parts that we ordered and that they're charging us the correct amounts, and giving that information over to the admin division, who would then actually just do the processing of the paperwork. And then the remainder of the time would help to manage the pool vehicle program, manage the shop inventory, manage the fuel depot and the fuel deliveries, and then manage. Right now, primarily, we're disposing of our old vehicles through Municipal and putting them up. And that is, we do have to go in and advertise and coordinate with potential buyers and stuff like that. So, and then execute the sale. So that's about what they would do. It is looking at a lot of just, so when we talk about sourcing fleet parts and repairs, making sure we're getting the best value for our money, but also making sure that we're getting the best part for the repair that we need in the specific vehicle. As these vehicles get more and more, again, it's kind of similar to the conversation we've had with building maintenance. As they get more high tech, there's just more variety. There's more parts that can break. As the computer systems in the vehicles get more up to date, it does take a little bit more research to make sure that we're purchasing the correct part and going to the correct location for a repair and getting the best value for a dollar.
Thank you, Cecilia. Go ahead, Barry.
So just, so who is performing this function now, or how is this being done currently?
So it's being done currently primarily by our fleet supervisor. But to be frank, he gets pulled in a lot of different directions depending on insurance issues and whatever else needs to be addressed throughout the town. So he's providing it, although I think it would be fair to say he feels like he's scrambling to provide it to his standard. I would also say a lot of the ordering is happening at the mechanic and master mechanic level. The issue is their primary focus is to fix things quickly. It's not necessarily to source parts. So they're going to call their vendor, they're going to get the price, they're going to order it, and they're going to have it delivered. They're not going to sit around and say, hey, that price seems high, and then call a secondary or a third vendor. So I think really it's having an individual whose focus is to make sure that we're being efficient, as opposed to our mechanics whose focus is to make sure that our vehicles are safe.
Oh, Dick, you're on mute.
What's the round numbers? What's the cost of the parts that are bought in the course of a year? $200,000?
Hold on one second, I can look it up. It's right. Yeah, I would say round cost, just looking at our vehicle supplies. There's some other items that come.
So
out
if we're overpaying by 10%, that's a $20,000 item. I'm just trying to quantify.
I can provide some examples. I think that might
Okay.
help there.
Thank you. Any other questions on this DSR4?
So I also would like, if this is something that you want to pursue, to really look at what else this position can do. I still am not convinced that every division or, a single division needs its own admin person. So I would still ask you to look at that.
So the only thing I'll say is that this is the one operations division that doesn't have secondary support in the management cycle. So again, it's a smaller division than fleet highway or water and sewer. But I know there's some capacity concerns because they don't have that additional support available to them.
Okay, the next DSR4, priority 6 is custodian.
Hold on, Josh, before we go there, I'm just curious, and
Sure.
we talked about these departments kind of in silos, and it sounds like there is overlap, and I guess it's just hard when you're in the weeds like this, trying to assess how much, to Louise's point, how much cross-pollination, I guess, for lack of a better term, can be done, and I'm sure is already being done amongst these departments for a number of these positions, and just to optimize, instead of adding more bodies within each department, optimize across departments.
So I think I would say the admin analyst we would be looking for recruiting for this position is not the same admin analyst we'd be recruiting for purchasing. We would be looking for somebody who would be working more in the service manager industry in the private sector, for example. So not the person who's fixing your car, but that person that you talk to, who understands how the car is supposed to work and what needs to be done and can explain it kind of more. I'll say our current fleet supervisor came from that background. So he has all the qualifications to be a mechanic, but that was not his primary function. He was a service manager. So he dealt with more about workloads, efficiencies, parts ordering, and managing the shop floor. So I think we're looking at somebody with more of a background in fleet, not necessarily a mechanic. So it is a little bit more specialized in a certain direction than an analyst we might hire in a different division.
Okay. Any other questions on that? So the custodian, priority 6. Do you want to talk through that, Karis or Cecilia?
Yeah, I'm hoping this is relatively simple, but essentially we added a float custodian. It was like 7 or 8 years ago when we had less square footage, and we're looking at adding a secondary float custodian. I think our main focus was on how do we provide services for all of our clients, all of our building occupants. And one of the issues we have is that staff has vacations. We do limit sometimes when people can take vacations because of getting schools ready for school reopening. So there's a limited window when people can take time off. And also dealing with issues, custodial work happens to be an area where there's higher rates of injury and other things. So we had created a float custodian position. What we have found is that float custodian position ends up backfilling a more longer term absence. And then we don't actually have that that person that we can move to different buildings when we have absences in those buildings. So really this would be establishing a second person that we have to either permanently assign to backfill for longer term absences, or somebody that we have in order to be flexible when we have a building closing. For example, we have one float custodian. We have, I'm gonna get this wrong, 8 schools? 8 schools. So one of them is out, one float custodian does not, we get 2 out in the same day, and now we have capacity issues. So it's really just trying to get us more capacity for our ability to deal with absenteeism.
And so this would be a floater. They would not be dedicated to a particular building.
Correct.
On average, we have about 6 absences on any given day, just due to the number of custodians that we have, in addition to, like Karis had mentioned, the vacation time, the sick time, that includes any type of absence for whatever reason.
And how many custodian positions are there in total?
41.
And how many of those are filled?
Right now, all of them.
All of them are filled. There are no vacancies.
Custodian seems to be the one area that we're not having issues recruiting and retaining.
Okay.
One of the benefits of downsizing office space in Boston. But it was really struck me that 15% of the population is absent on average every day.
Yeah. Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump on what Dick said. Given such a high sick rate, I'm sure you must have lots of people moving different buildings to cover each other right now. Or what happens when a couple people are out in the same building? What do you do then?
So I just clarify, it's not just a sick rate, it also includes vacation time, and we have staff who stayed for a long time, which is great, but they've accrued 4 or 5 weeks of vacation as part of their benefits. But as far as how we compensate for it, it's through overtime if we have the capacity. Oftentimes it's backfilling 4 hours for an 8-hour shift, for example. I've been talking about this for a while. We're not there yet, but we're getting close to a point where that's no longer going to be sustainable, because individuals that we have who are newer into our organization seem to be less inclined to work as much overtime as other individuals who have been here for longer and who are more interested in working higher amounts of overtime.
I suspect it's certainly more job rewarding for a custodian to be in a building and know the staff and get to know the lay of the land and get somewhat comfortable and confident in what they're doing. Have you ever explored a rotating by having people just move from building to building? Because I would imagine the tasks by and large are probably the same. And would you gain some efficiencies if you had folks moving about?
So we have thought about it, talked about it, done it a little bit. I'll be frank with you. I never understood that people were as emotionally connected to their custodian as I did when I was in the acting role for the facilities department. You move one custodian, you think you're like, oh, you're just moving a person over to a new role because it's a better fit or something. And you get a call from the principal immediately. What do you mean? This is the best person. I don't want to lose them. So you're right in that people definitely do develop a home, so to speak. I think float custodians we found tend to be the entry point. And then when a position opens up within our organization in a particular location, they tend to drift to those positions. So we don't have the same float custodian for particularly long.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions about this position? Okay. Next, priority 7 is the RTS overtime for early release days.
Hoping this is also simple, but basically in the last year, the schools have moved to a model where they're having every other Wednesday as an early release. I'm not sure if you've been to the Common on a half day on a Wednesday. It is highly populated with young people in town who use our facilities and fill up our trash cans. So on a good news, they fill up our trash cans and hopefully we're not having litter, but that then needs to be removed. And it's one day where we have this excess capacity. It's not an everyday function. So this is essentially building into our overtime budget practice we've had over the last year, which is to provide an extra pickup on Wednesdays when we have early release days. And this is to the Heights and the Common.
Any questions about this?
I'm just curious, why would this be DSR4 versus just an increment to your, the hours in your budget?
I'll be frank, I think it's to call attention to the issue of public litter and public trash. It seems to be that that's a conversation I'm having a lot between parks issues, litter issues, overflowing, trash cans, people putting their personal trash in trash cans. So I think it's just to call attention to the burden that this has on the RTS staff.
Okay.
Although the one thing I would say is that we should probably just add it to the budget and pull it out after you draw attention to it. Because if it doesn't get funded, then the message is you shouldn't do it. So you should decide whether you want it to be a DSR4.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Priority 8. This is high school athletic game day support overtime.
This is a request from the Parks and Forestry Division related to high school athletics events. They're just getting requests from the high school athletics division department to provide additional services during events as far as setup, trash, and breakdown. We had a conversation about fees and whether or not we could charge this off as fees. We haven't had that conversation yet with the athletics department. So we will certainly pursue that conversation with them as well.
Just a question, Karis, who has provided these services in the past? Like game days and nights aren't new.
Either the services weren't being provided or they weren't being provided, I'll call it to the standard that the schools were looking for. Or we were finding that we had more issues the following day because we had public litter or trash or overflowing barrels. But I can certainly provide more details. I know for certain events we've provided service. So I think like bigger games we have, like maybe the high school Thanksgiving game, but I'll get more details about what we have provided in the past and what we would be providing here.
Thank you.
Any other questions? The next DSR4 is priority 9. We actually just discussed that already, the administrative analyst. And priority 10 is the sustainability coordinator.
Priority 0, because I didn't really know how to put a request that really isn't for my budget.
Oh, okay. I assumed that we were just missing leading numbers. Okay.
Effectively, it was something, again, I wanted to call attention to, but knowing that it wouldn't likely be funded this year. As part of the town's climate and resiliency action plan that we're working on and the committee that was just established, this would be providing a position that could help provide direction town-wide to how to fulfill those goals, whatever they end up being, as far as both how to deal with our carbon footprint, how to deal with resiliency. And I think in DPW, we recognize the importance of it. I'm not entirely sure that that's the appropriate place for the position to be, which is sort of why we called attention to it, but then didn't prioritize it because it's not really something that we're suggesting to add to our operating budget.
It would seem to me if there's a big if there, this is a position we need, it would be in the town manager's budget. I mean, if the idea was to pull together all the different elements of the town and coordinate that, that seems to me that's the focus of the power rather than in the DPW.
And do we can ask this of the town manager also, know when we'll expect to know when the goals will be developed? Because I imagine that this position, the functions of the position may vary depending upon the goals, which haven't yet been established.
I believe they have a 6-month charge, or that their charges for this year, and that the deliverable at the end would be the plan.
Okay. The next DSR4, it's marked priority 1. Is that correct, Karis?
Yeah, this is the future form that we talked about. So this is the next year, 2024
Got it. Thank you. So this is the heavy motor vehicle, heavy motor equipment operator, right? So we did discuss that a bit before.
So maybe it's appropriate to turn to the DSR fives and then finish up with the brief thing on the capital.
Sure. And then after that, water and sewer.
Yep.
It's a long
The,
night, sorry.
I think on the DSR fives, one of them is the annual $1 million expense for the maintenance thing. So I don't think that's a major issue of discussion, because I think we're all basically believe that that makes sense and they've identified the projects. The one that may not make as much sense and has developed some discussion in the past is the survey. And this really is the survey you were talking about earlier, Josh, the land survey, and the question of whether we need to continue to expend significant dollars, $100,000 a year on that. And as I recall, John Conley in the past has raised the question, how significant are these identified properties relative to the longer term interests of the town?
So I just can speak to this very briefly, and I know it's certainly open to lots of different opinions. I think it's hard, again, to have this conversation without Tony here. I think the two main reasons that I understand for doing these have been in preparation of a project. So we have acquired a lot of parcels in town that we don't actually have surveys for. So this is not new, this is older. So we don't always know what we own. And so if we need to develop it, or somebody wants to run a quick study and say, hey, can we put a school on this property? We just don't have the information to be able to provide that at a moment's notice. My understanding from talking to Tom is these surveys can take up, 5 months. So it's not an instantaneous process if we're trying to evaluate options. The other thing I will say is I'm pretty sure he was looking at doing this for protection of the community. So I think his concern was somebody falls, somebody hurts himself, somebody has an issue, and we're trying to determine if they're falling on public property or not, on a town property. We don't have necessarily that information on these parcels in order to be able to quickly provide that information. So I think this is sort of a proactive approach that we had in DPW to provide that information when it's requested of us, because our town engineering department really likes to provide information quickly. But I can understand multiple opinions about the value of that.
Okay, there are 5 quote wooded areas on the priority list. How frequently are they the source of pedestrian traffic?
I have to get back to you on that information.
Yeah, I mean, how many people are going to be falling in that area?
Oh,
Go ahead, Rick.
here, so along the same line, this is a priority list. Do you have a sense of how long that list is?
I think it's long from what I understand. I can ask Tom if there's ones that aren't included, but I believe there are. I think there's lots of tiny little parcels in town that the town owns.
Gotcha.
Karis, my understanding is that these surveys can potentially expire after a certain amount of time and have to be redone. Is that correct?
Let me confirm with our town engineer on that.
Okay,
I'll
thanks.
talk to Tom Ryder.
That
Oh, go ahead, Rick.
here is just a kind of an informational question. What do other towns do regarding this? Or was this Tony, God rest him, his pet peeve?
I don't know. I can certainly reach out to a few communities and find out how they handle it. I don't know if there's many other communities that are always looking at different ways of solving problems like we are. So, there's a wooded area and we see that and someone say, I want a dog park in this wooded area. What would it cost us to do that? Well, the first step is we would need a survey. I don't know if that happens as much. I'm sure it happens in a lot of communities, but just find out how they handle it. But I do think, Tony was a very protected precision engineer. And so I think there was some of that as well.
Okay, thank you.
There is the RTS service model study, is there any significant belief that we're going to come up with a different approach for the RTS than, I mean, is it any serious thought of a town-wide pickup service? I thought that was not in the cards at all.
I think the conversation is less on my level and more on a political level, as far as what the desires of the community are. So I think we haven't surveyed the community, and my understanding is 20 years, as to what people are looking for and then what they would expend in order to get that service. One other thing I'll say is we typically look at the service model when we think about making major investments in the infrastructure. The last time we looked at it was when we decided to invest in our current infrastructure over at the RTS. Some of that infrastructure is aging, and we're looking at, in the next 5 to 10 years, making some fairly significant proposals to upgrade or improve that infrastructure. And so it's a good time to look at whether or not the community has a desire to move in a different direction, to figure out, if the transfer station is having major problems and we need to put in a significant amount of money in order to keep that building operating, is this a time to invest in that building or to invest in equipment to do pickup service?
Okay. Conscious of our timetable on the capital items, why don't you just, a number of them are just part of an ongoing program of replacing roll-offs and so forth. Could you just talk about the things that are not part of the normal replacement cycle?
Sure, I'm actually going to defer to Cecilia if she can provide a little bit more on each of the operating capital items.
Trying to find the.
Yes, let me just turn to the page.
Yeah, it's on page 216, 217 of the book.
Okay, so some of the newer ones that aren't the ones you see on a regular basis, so not the RTS ones, which are annual requests every year, are in building maintenance. We are looking to replace their utility trailer. This is a $5,000 piece of equipment. It's basically vital in transporting a lot of the larger items that they use, as well as the gym equipment. So the schools have gymnastics equipment that moves every 1 to 2 months. And without this trailer, building maintenance staff are unable to move the pieces of equipment. It does rotate. They do like a traveling gymnastics seminar for the students. Additionally, they are looking to purchase a utility tractor that would be used in snow removal at the schools. There's some schools that have a very large footprint with footpaths, that are just difficult to shovel, especially with the number of custodians at the school. So this would help to remove snow in that. And then the electric mower in Parks and Forestry, we have zero-turn mowers currently. This would be an all-electric mower. It's a newer piece of equipment that we're looking to use, but it's more energy efficient, more fuel efficient, and it would help us to do a lot of our smaller grass cutting and trimming programs that we do in Parks and Forestry.
And then there's also the batting cages, I see.
Oh, yeah. So that was in there last year as well, basically to go through the town on a regular cycle and either repair or replace depending on the condition of the batting cages throughout town. So it's not addressing all of them every year. It's addressing them one at a time until we get through them, and then reevaluating to see if we need to continue, or if there's we can take a couple of years off because the batting cages are in good shape.
These are the backstops, right? Behind home plate. That's what we're talking about, or are we talking about other types of cages?
Yes.
Okay. How many of those are there in town?
I am not sure off the top of my head.
That would be helpful to know. Just
Yeah, I think we have Ed on. If you wanted to bring him in, he loves talking about that. Unless he's left already.
Can we
He's still here, I
clarify
see
if these
him.
are actually batting cages or backstops?
Yep.
'Cause there's
I
not that
understand
many
them as
batting cages.
backstops. Yeah.
And there's not that
Batting
many
cages are
batting
like for
cages.
practice and
Yeah.
like with automated baseballs. Right? In any event, there are other, did you talk about the open top trailer and the roll-off containers as well?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was under the impression that we were gonna, those are the regular annual requests at the RTS. And so we put them in again to continue replacing the open top trailer. All of ours are on a 7-year replacement cycle. And then the 2 roll-off containers, we purchase about 2 40-yard roll-off containers every year just to maintain our inventory, that they're in good, good condition.
Okay. Hi, Ed. Welcome. Do you know how many of the backstops or batting cages there are?
Yes, so there is a difference. We are talking about specifically batting cages, like the ones you would find at Claxton Field, at Mills Field, at Memorial Park, and then lastly at the Phasio at Aces Small. So we have 4 batting cages in town.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we would do 1 per year. Is that $30,000 each? Okay. And right now, what's the replacement? There is no replacement cycle, right? Or is it on an ad hoc basis?
Yes, right now there is no replacement. We priced out replacing all batting cages when we were doing the synthetic turf project. So we have some numbers from a few years ago when RAD did that work for us at the Phasio. So we do have numbers, but right now there is no replacement cycle at all.
Maybe this is in the weeds a little bit. How old are they in general on average?
Sure. So the Memorial Park, as well as the one at the Phasio, were part of the Field of Dreams project. Memorial Park, we've rebuilt once since then. Claxton Field, we built internally, Parks and Forestry, approximately 6 years ago for the softball group. And then lastly, Mills Field is probably the oldest of all 4, and I don't know the specific date when that was built.
And Ed, this quote of 30,000 is based on this information from a couple of years ago. That seems like an awful lot for a batting cage. Basically, is this got a single batter, single plate?
So Memorial Park is a double, and Claxton is an open air. It could probably facilitate 2 batters, but the vision through that $30,000 approximate estimate was to actually install synthetic turf surfaces. Right now, it's a mishmash of stone dust, dirt, clay, and you name it, Dick. So this was to really formalize professional style quality batting cages that would be to a standard that we've never seen before. And something that would last for years. Right now, like I said, the more naturalized batting cages are exposed to the elements and certainly don't last as long.
When you say last 4 years, what's the expected life expectancy?
I mean, I guess that's a guess for right now because it would be yet to be determined. We haven't seen anything like this, but I think, we found that turf lasts for 10 to 12 to 15 years if it's maintained. So I think we build it this way, certainly a lot longer than a natural occurring stone dust path style batting cage.
So, okay, so my original concept was incorrect before. This is not just the metal fencing, this is the entire batting area.
That's correct. The netting, the surfacing, the plates, the mounds, all the accoutrements, it would be everything included.
Got it.
Seems to me to be a little bit of a nice to have rather than need to have. I'm not saying you don't need a batting cage, but Fenway Park standard batting cage may be a little overkill.
Dick, were there other items on your agenda that you wanted to get through?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. I guess the next two items are sewer and water enterprise budgets. Karis, do you want to give a brief summary?
So I think the main summary is we don't have a lot of significant changes in this particular budget. A few things that have occurred. One major one is that we've had a little bit of instability at the superintendent level. We had Sean Harrington, who was with us for about a year, and he left to go to another community as an assistant DPW director. And we've been very fortunate in Needham to be able to utilize Mike Gretzky. We did a pretty broad search to backfill his position. We did some national advertising, and actually the most qualified individual certainly came from our own staffing. So Mike had been a project manager in the building design and construction division for quite a number of years, I think 5 or 6 years. Before that, he was a volunteer on many boards and committees in town. And the majority of his experience professionally prior to coming to Needham was actually in the water and sewer field, largely in the construction field. So this maintenance is a little bit of a transition for him as he gets acclimated to this role. So we've been fortunate to have him, but I think he may have started the day the budgets were due, or he may have started a few days after. So we really had to put this budget together without having a superintendent. So it's really a status quo budget of maintaining our existing services. That has to do with our new contracts that are in place. Those are accounted for, but there really aren't any major changes to the way the division operates. I imagine when we present our budget next year, we'll have more meat to the budget as we discuss how we want to move forward with those divisions.
I have a question. The ARPA funds are going to be used in large part for water and sewer upgrades. How do you envision staffing or supporting all of this work? Do you have enough staff to do all of that?
No, so we are actually, I'm putting the application in this week, and we have actually put out a posting for a project manager to be dedicated to ARPA funds. I'm hoping that they will sort of take it cradle to grave, each one of these projects. The 2 projects that we are definitely doing 100% out of ARPA right now, as long as the state accepts them, is Walker Pond, the second phase of that project, which is to clean up the water of the actual physical pond so it fits into the water quality component of that requirement. And then the second one is actually the reservoir, which is a NIPD's requirement, which will address the a small dredging component. It will address the impairment of the water body. So right now, Alderbrook is a level 5 contaminated impaired water body, and that comes from the reservoir. So cleaning up the reservoir will provide better water quality in Alderbrook, and it's actually part of the town's NIPD's permit that we have to do the dredging at that facility. Those 2 projects will take about a third to a half of the funding for ARPA. And then the third project, depending on the scope, because we're currently right now doing the design and feasibility work, is there is a large interceptor sewer, which is like a larger sewer that conveys a lot of waste that runs along 128 in Greendale that we either need to replace or hopefully reline. If we reline it, the cost should fit within ARPA. If we need to replace some portions of it or all of it, it would exceed that, and we would be coming to the Finance Committee for supplemental funding.
But that Greendale, it sounds like that will be outsourced. It won't be town staff.
All three projects will be outsourced.
Oh, okay. Got it. Any other questions about water and sewer? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Karis. Thank you, Cecilia. I know it's a long night, but this is a really important department. We really appreciate everything you do.
Thank you so much. Now we have to prepare for snow.
Yeah, not much. It's Thursday night, right? We're supposed to get snow?
Thursday and a Friday, yep.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you.
Take care. Next item, just issues not reasonably anticipated. I guess we got an email about an executive session that's meant to be held next Wednesday, the 12th. I don't know any details beyond the email that was sent out. I don't currently know of any means for remote access, but if anything changes, we'll circulate that information. We will be remote next week as well. The case numbers are just a bit too high for my comfort, at least. I hope to be in person or hybrid again soon. Anyone have anything else that they want to provide updates on? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for staying late. I look forward to seeing everyone next week then. Is there a motion to adjourn? Is there a second? Thanks. We'll take a roll call. Dick?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Carol?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Good night, everyone.
Hey, do we have to pull out?